saying I'm not expert in that field, but I've been thinking about cities for a long time, starting from being an urban studies major at the University of Pennsylvania, through to being an urban activist for a while, and thinking a lot about cities in the context of my professional work as an economist. What we're going to do today is to talk about some of the forces that I see at work in terms of a political economy perspective on the challenges of transport in the future of the city. And I'm going to start with some of the three basic visions that talk, kind of socio-economic visions of urban space, and the tensions in those visions that we have to take into account as we think about how transport can be unfolded. I'm going to make an argument that we have particular challenges that are in front of us that in some sense have not yet been fully understood or taken on board by those working perhaps in the areas of infrastructure planning. So we're going to kind of go through past that into looking at some of the dynamics that can destabilize cities. That'll be part two. And then we'll put this into context, and in so doing, we'll take a very quick tour through several cities in Brazil. So the first part then. And just to say that urban visionaries, generally speaking, have been pretty conflicted about the tension between optimal designs for cities and the social characteristics and social warehousing aspects of cities. That the classic kind of social map provided for geographers and other urbanists was the Park, Burgess, and McKenzie map of Chicago, 1925, that essentially shows a way in which the social classes in Chicago, the immigrants and those in the slums and the well-off and the not so well-off, could live together. And of course, this reminds us of, say, Engel's map on work on the urban, but it's very much a map of Chicago as we have it. This is a particular perspective on people as basically alien or the other, and the problem of separating people who don't want to touch. Now, by contrast, another vision, in almost coterminous in time, from a very idealized view, it talks about Christolaire, and from Christolaire and his idea of central place theory, which turns into a kind of a map looking at southern Germany, turns into kind of central place theory and a kind of idealized maps, with the idea that basically we should imagine people optimizing based on purely economic criteria, spatial and so on. Now, just as the Burgess Park map is linked to a particular historical epoch in the United States, so too this map that we have from Christolaire is very particular as well. As a functioning map of urban space, it doesn't go so well. As Hartshorne and Alexander in a classic geography text mention, it completely ignores the demand side, and assumes that everybody's a rural farmer kind of with a need to exchange. And basically this somehow gets incorporated into theoretical discourse in a way that gets people to really not want to talk about optimal planning in geography. That said, Paul Krugman and Porter still carry on the ideas. So these are kind of ideas that are too idealistic or too historically grounded. I want to add a third, and they lead to these, they kind of participate in these kind of confused images we have. This is 1925, imagining the 1950s city, and here we have everything together. But part of it would be, in some sense, if we think of this as Chicago, there are the freight tubes where the material that comes from the working classes is brought in, and while the privileged classes have access to pedestrian travel and the pleasures of the city, and while others have efficient ways to move around. There's no real consideration here of how things actually work. Now, the third model, though, is one that talks about that and really for the first time brings the agents into the process. This is Thomas Schelling, who won a Nobel Prize as one of the progenitors of complexity theory. We heard mention earlier today of linear complexity. Well, certainly, he came up with many, many ideas in game theory, but the one I want to talk about here that's relevant for the city is his model of urban segregation. He talked about the idea of checkerboard, and that if we had agents that are basically in a situation where they can choose where to live, and if we have W agents who want to be separated from B agents, that we could see, and we could think of many different configurations, that they will naturally separate in an urban space. Now, what I've done actually is to build a simulation model that takes that, because his little model has some virtues. It's simple, and you don't have to go through all of the, let's say, investment cost of real agent-based modeling in order to come up with some simple sort of messages. And what I've just done is to imagine his space as a city with a formal sector and an informal sector. And I'm thinking here, initially, I was thinking of a developing world city. I was working with some friends in Rio de Janeiro who are at the Brazilian Planning Bank, and we were talking about the pattern of urban expansion in Rio and the challenges that was going to make for those living in the formalized sections of the city and for the overall coherence of the city. We'll visit Rio at the end of the talk. And basically, in thinking about that, essentially, urban expansion becomes a process of filling in the empty spaces, and in some sense, it's the ever-expanding city, which is a vision that is familiar to us from many cities around the world. Now, let's skip actually De Soto, but just to say that this can be envisioned. There's this Hernando de Soto, who's a figure that's kind of tortured development economics for many years, with a vision that essentially having informal sectors grow is fine because you're unleashing entrepreneurial zeal and spirit, and essentially it has to do with allowing people to have property rights in their informal spaces. That said, I mean, the kind of vision is that this darkened space here is the formal zone of the city, that you can have people who are working as domestics and then having different functions in the city. This is my simulation model as I start to populate it with workers and domestics and government workers, factory making tradables, and then firms making non-tradables, and start to put that into motion. I'll spare you all the details, but just to say that in some sense, the vision is that, one possible vision is that you can have new successful firms coming in, hiring more workers, more people who maybe started life as domestics, move into higher skilled, higher wage jobs, make more money, and you can basically generate the tax income that's needed to expand the extent of your formalized space. Now, when I say formalized space, I mean schools and transport and all the other things, so that we have a kind of healthily growing city based on high wage dynamics. Now, this is where things get complicated, though, as we look at the real cities of our current period. There's two tendencies that have come together that challenge this. One is the existence of this period of global neoliberalism, characterized, as we know, by deregulation, privatization, and austerity macro. And there's been some things that we've seen happening since 1980s. The erosion of government will to really plan on that scale, and of course an erosion of its capacity to do that as well. The ideal of the government in the imaginary of many policymakers and even citizens is of the government no longer as a productive force for organizing social life, but instead as itself a rent seeker, so that the individuals are abandoned to their own purposes. And indeed, there's kind of this, the reaction to the housing bubble, subprime loan collapse in Southern California was perhaps surprisingly not a reaction of anger at the government that had permitted these predatory lenders to hold such sway, but instead there was a feeling of personal failure on the part of people that I observed in many of the counseling and other sessions. And combined with this, we have downward pressure on wages and a supermobility of the wealthy. And so just to say that there's some things about this period, the rise of neoliberal discourse replacing monetarism, the kind of cynicism of the whole thing, which goes to the view that your government may not care about you. There's some famous figures on that page. And then this sort of reaction of, perhaps we're in this vision where the citizen is just the object to be taken control of by the police and left to his or her own devices. Now, what this means when we set in motion the idea of neoliberal context to my model is that essentially what happens is that there is an erosion of the high wage employment, and little by little this space, the formalized urban space actually shrinks. Now, again, details are not important, but the shrinkage is due to the fact that essentially some people are maintaining their jobs while being paid less. People are replacing higher wage jobs with lower wage jobs, and the capacity of the tax-paying part of the citizenry to support its urban infrastructure is diminished. That leads to challenges which then are augmented by the second kind of challenge to coherent urban existence, which is the sometimes now predatory behavior of the financial sector. Kind of two dynamics. On the one hand, the financial sector has been reorganizing itself to super include the income stable and wealthy customers, a variety of things, and leading to home ownership and safe spaces, gentrification, and so on, kind of making spaces safe for people. And then there's the 1% with very particular circumstances that have a lot to do with avoiding tax and maintaining mobility at all costs. These are trends that lead us to the idea of places where there's a polarization of people by income and security class, so that we see an erosion of public services and basically privately secured space emerging as more important. Meanwhile, on the bottom end, there's been predation. I'll spare you the details, but just to say that the problem of financial exclusion, which was something we dealt with when I began life as an urban activist a long time ago, evolved eventually into the problem of predatory financial inclusion. There's been a lot of work on that I've been involved in Leyshan and Thrift and others, so I'll spare you the details.
5 minutes.
But basically, just to say that the upshot has been that the financial sector, in the context of this kind of reduced wage context, has been engaged in asset stripping. That gives us a very, now I'll skip that, just to say, and I've got some pictures here that show you how you can use the same map. This is from a presentation in Brazil, so that there's a little bit of minor Portuguese here on the page. And just to say that essentially the same map gives us these problems. We can interpret the Schelling model as a model of, on the one hand, redlining, and on the other hand, discrimination. So just to say that these trends too are out there and inhibiting people's capacity to remain empowered urban citizens. Now, I'll spare you this, but 3 slides, because I want to be sure we don't have to skip the Brazilian part. But this is just to show you that these patterns are typically rooted, and I've heard this to be true, and to the extent that I'm learning about English cities, it seems to be true in this country as well, that basically the area that was redlined by the Federal Housing Administration in the 1930s turns out to be the place where there was high rates of loan denial when there were conventional loans on offer. It also turns out to be the place where there was a preponderance of subprime lending. And we could go through to the foreclosure and all of that. So that basically says, let's try to see what this all means for transport. Okay, first, we've got this model that shows the kind of pressures at work. And these pressures put, these forces put pressure on sort of the formal sector residents, the middle class, kind of the old middle class, that are driven in this model simulation into the informal sector, are exposed to lots of financial risks. While the informal sector grows, it can't solve the problems that are posed by the erosion of coherent urban space. And so these tensions arise then between 2 uses of the city. For some, it's a locus for the collection of remittance payments, and for others, it's a locus of accumulation or reinvestment of capital. Those who are interested in a coherent living space kind of are unable to defend those boundaries necessarily, and there's kind of no way to really resolve the contradiction. You've got to draw a line somewhere. You've got to have living wages or draw a boundary around the city, one way or the other. And so, inequality here is something that leads into self-reinforcing cycles that basically undercut the capacity of the city to serve both the low income, the middle income, and the rich. The rich want to withdraw, the middle income can't protect their lifestyle, and basically public services, including public infrastructure, suffers. And we have to keep in mind public transport is a public service and is part of public infrastructure. So, last slide, then we're going to go to Brazil, our last substantive slide. In terms of the right to the city, if we privatize transport solutions, the cost of movement in urban space is going to be more class and wealth differentiated, as will the distribution of urban space itself, right? And if transport solutions are seen as solutions to tragedy of the commons problems, we may have more socially integrated cities, but that's going to be an investment decision. And achieving this outcome will depend on the capacity of urban citizens, generally speaking, to counter these coercive pressures that have been imposed from neoliberalism and from an unaccountable financial core in the global north especially. Now, let's do a quick visit through 3 cities. This is going to be a picture show. And what we're going to do is just look at, basically, here's questions, right? Could we imagine, sort of, will the voices of lower income workers be heard? Could we imagine affordable transport alternatives? Could fiscal capacity be sufficient to generate these? Okay, let's tour quickly. Let's start with the famous city of Curitiba. Now, Curitiba is known as a city that's transport friendly, and the transport friendliness includes the lower income residents of the city who live in favelas. They've got differentiated, mode differentiated transport lanes, well designed to allow people to travel around. It's kind of a model for including the favela, not eliminating it from planning view. One thing that permits this in the case of that city, this is that city, Curitiba, is it's flat. It's part of the plain of Brazil. Now, if we go to our second stop of 4, very quick, as you can see, sorry for that, is Belo Horizonte. Now, Belo Horizonte is in the mountains, Minas Gerais, and a very creative and curvy place. And it looks like this, and the problem there is that the city becomes so impassable that one solution that's emerging is something called this kind of new revolution of a enclosed, isolated community that's self-sufficient called Alphaville, where the apartments sell for as much as R$1 million, which is about $500,000 now. Here's what it looks like. It's a kind of idealized place. There are workers building it who will never be able to afford to live there. They even include a little transport grid where the kids can pretend to drive. And the idea, right, is Alphaville is there. There's your central city, and it should all be good. In principle, we're just doing the Crystal A, kind of optimal urban design, and it should look like this. There's a beautiful Niemeyer building there. But in practice, it looks often like that. But if you want to see real urban stress, what you want to do is go to Sao Paulo. Now, Sao Paulo, what's the solution there? Well, there's the growth of the city, out of control. And it's a city in which, as in my urban simulation model, there's lots of informal areas all around the side. The yellow in particular are informal communities. As a consequence, there's been no provision, there's no extension of public transport that's effective, and so consequently, the wealthy are now using helicopters. It's become a common mode of transportation, and here's from above, helipads typically located, and there are some, of course, at Alphaville, for the rich. Finally, and lastly, in the red zone is Rio de Janeiro, which is about to try to avoid embarrassment for the World Cup. Now, this is a map that comes from the Rio Olympics. Notice the way we see the city. We see, here's the Centro, and there's over there, then Copacabana, and then some of the other things. Okay, that's the imaginary, that's like the New Yorker's view of the world. Now let's look at how Rio really is. Excuse me there. And the idea in that vision is that, people can use informal transit. And while informal transit, like motorcycles, is convenient for a favela like Rocinha, which is right about there, Ipanema, Leblon, right there, sorry. Actually, the problem is that that favela is right there, actually there, And what's happened is that in those zones of the city that you saw go as far as this, and actually as prices rise in the favelas, people are moving out north and west into places that are the wild, wild west, where there is no provision, little policing. The UPP you hear about is in the favelas close to the city. Most of the young people I work with, young urbanists, regard this as a kind of, effort to move the real estate to get more respectable people in there. And this is a picture of your metro map. It covers nothing in the urban area. And so you have the consequence that we have an impassable city with huge and impossible commutes that's completely unfriendly to the large mass of the working class that's being pushed out of the urban zone in a city that's no longer able to afford or even to envision how it's going to pay for adequate infrastructure. This is a particular map generated by activists showing you all the anticipated things that were promised. The airport, not connected to the metro. These different sites, the Olympic Park, which will not be reached by metro. Line 4 doesn't exist. Only Line 1 and Line 2 exist. And these are the problems of the city that can no longer handle its infrastructure responsibilities. So I come to you from California. We too have our issues. That's another story. And if you want to get in touch, there's an email. Thanks for your attention.